She stands on a velvet podium, dressed in Parisian silk, worth more than a herd of thoroughbred horses. But make no mistake, she is not a guest at this ball, she is the merchandise. This is the fancy trade, a secret world where mothers bleached their own daughters' skin with acid, praying they were beautiful enough to be sold as concubines rather than die in the fields. But as you are about to see, this golden cage had a trap door, and for these women, beauty wasn't a salvation, it was just a cruel delay before the slaughter. Under the soaring, frescoed dome of the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans, a heavy, unnatural silence hangs in the air like a physical weight. It is a quiet that feels thick and suffocating, pressing down on the lungs of everyone present in the Grand Rotunda, creating an atmosphere more akin to a funeral than a marketplace. The only sound breaking this oppressive stillness is the rhythmic, sharp shuffling of expensive leather boots moving across the cold, polished marble floor. Wealthy men circle like sharks, their spurs occasionally clicking against the stone, marking out their territory in this cathedral of commerce where human flesh is the currency. In the absolute center of the room, raised above the crowd on a circular platform upholstered in deep crimson velvet, stands a solitary figure. She is a young woman, her posture rigid and statue-like, frozen in a moment of terrifying visibility that she has been groomed for since birth. Her skin is the color of polished ivory, so pale that it almost defies the legal definition of her existence in the strict racial hierarchy of the American South. Her features are fine and delicate, betraying generations of mixed heritage that have culminated in this specific, tragic moment of aesthetic perfection. She is draped in a gown of imported silk, cut according to the latest fashions from Paris, with lace trimmings that cost more than a farmhand earns in a decade. To a stranger entering the room from the bright sunlight of the street, this scene might look like the presentation of a debutante at a high society ball. But the illusion instantly shatters upon closer inspection of her hands, which hang empty and trembling at her sides, devoid of the fan that a lady of status would carry. She is not a guest at this celebration of wealth, she is the sole reason for the gathering, the centerpiece of a dark and lucrative ritual known as the fancy trade. The men surrounding the podium do not look at her with the respectful admiration due to a society belle, but with the cold, dissecting gaze of seasoned investors. They are calculating potential returns and private pleasures, stripping away her humanity with their eyes before a single bid is placed or a word is spoken. This is the year 1858, the twilight of the antebellum era, and we are witnessing the absolute peak of a specialized, shadowy corner of the slave market. This auction block is dedicated to the sale of mixed-race women for the exclusive, unspoken purpose of forced concubinage. The man standing beside her, the auctioneer, holds a gavel made of heavy oak, an instrument that will decide her future with a single, indifferent strike. He raises his voice not to invite a dance, but to list her physical attributes as if he were describing a piece of fine furniture or a prize-winning thoroughbred horse. She is a quadroon, a term that carries a heavy weight of exoticism and fetishization in this twisted economy of the Gulf Coast. She represents the ultimate luxury item for the Southern aristocrat, a trophy that signals both immense wealth and total dominance over the very biology of the enslaved population. Her tragedy lies in the cruel intersection of her genetics. She was born too beautiful to be wasted on the brutal, sun-scorched labor of the sugarcane fields. Yet, despite her light skin and European features, the law dictates that she is not white enough to claim ownership of her own soul or refuse the touch of a stranger. As the bidding begins, the numbers rising in the thousands, she remains silent, a living doll trapped in a nightmare of high commerce and moral decay. She is suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither, waiting to be sold to the men with the deepest pockets and the darkest desires. The destiny of the young woman on the velvet podium was not decided in the grand rotunda of the hotel, but years earlier in the dim, smoky light of a slave cabin. It began the very moment she took her first breath and her mother, a woman broken by labor, looked down to see the terrifyingly pale skin of her newborn daughter. In that instant, amidst the straw bedding and the smell of wood smoke, a tragedy of distorted maternal love was set into motion. The mother, whose own skin bore the dark legacy of the African coast, recognized immediately that her child carried the curse of the master's bloodline, a genetic echo that was both a danger and an opportunity. For a mother in bondage, seeing her own features softened and whitened in her child was a source of profound terror rather than pride. She knew that this lightness would draw eyes, that it would attract attention from the very men who held the power of life and death over their bodies. Yet, in the twisted logic of the plantation system, this beauty was also the only currency that might purchase a reprieve from a death sentence in the fields. The mother made a silent, heart-wrenching vow to sculpt this child not into a strong worker, but into an object of desire, a living doll that would be too valuable to break. This decision birthed a childhood of strange and isolating privilege, where the son became the ultimate enemy to be feared and avoided at all costs. While other children ran half-naked in the dust, hardening their bodies for future labor, this girl was kept indoors, hidden in the shadows of the cabin or the kitchen. The mother would sew wide-brimmed bonnets from scraps of cloth, forcing the child to wear them even on cloudy days to shield her porcelain complexion. Every ray of light that touched the girl's face was seen as a depreciation of her value, a threat to the investment that was her own skin. But the preservation of whiteness went beyond mere shade. It involved painful, daily rituals that bordered on torture. The mother would scrub the girl's knees and elbows with lemon juice and buttermilk, acidic mixtures designed to bleach away any hint of darkness that might betray her African heritage. The girl learned to endure the stinging of the acid on her sensitive skin, understanding vaguely that this pain was the price of her future survival. She was taught that her skin was her armor, and that any blemish or tan line was a chink in that armor that could let the brutality of the world inside. Her hands, unlike the calloused, scarred hands of her mother, were kept soft and useless, greased with animal fat and covered in old gloves at night. She was forbidden from touching the rough tools of the field, from picking cotton, or from engaging in any chore that might thicken her fingers or broaden her shoulders. While her peers learned the rhythm of the scythe and the weight of the sack, she was ushered into the back doors of the main house to learn the arts of the oppressor. She sat in corners, listening to the lessons given to the master's legitimate children, absorbing the cadence of their speech and the grace of their movements. She was taught to speak a refined, musical French, the language of the Creole aristocracy, erasing the dialect of the quarters from her tongue. This linguistic cleansing was essential. To command a high price as a fancy girl, she had to sound like a lady, even if the law regarded her as livestock. In secret, or sometimes with the amused permission of the mistress, she was taught to play the piano, her fingers dancing over the ivory keys. The music she produced was not the sorrowful spirituals of her people, but the light, frivolous waltzes that were popular in the parlors of New Orleans and Paris. She learned to sing, to dance, and to hold a conversation on polite topics, all while understanding that these skills were not for her own expression. She was being hollowed out, filled with the culture of a world that despised her, turning her into a perfect mirror for a white man's vanity. This education isolated her completely from the community of the enslaved, creating a wall of resentment and pity between her and her own kin. To the field hands, she was a house pet, a creature of unearned ease who did not share in their collective suffering and sweat. They watched her walk to the main house in her clean dresses, unaware of the psychological cage that was being built around her, bar by invisible bar. They could not see the terror in her mother's eyes, the desperate hope that this specific form of slavery would be lesser than the hell of the sugar cane harvest. The mother knew the reality of the cane fields, the relentless heat, the razor-sharp leaves that sliced the skin, and the grinding labor that killed men and women by their 30th birthday. She had seen too many bodies broken and discarded to wish that fate on a daughter who had a chance, however slim, to escape it. The fancy trade offered a horrific alternative, a life of sexual servitude, but one lived in silk sheets rather than on a dirt floor. It was a gamble that the role of a concubine, a placed woman, would offer physical safety, decent food, and perhaps, eventually, manumission. It was a monstrous choice for a mother to make, to groom her own child for the bed of a stranger in order to save her from the whip of an overseer. Every lesson in etiquette, every application of whitening cream, was an act of love twisted by the impossible circumstances of chattel slavery. The girl grew up understanding that her body did not belong to her, it was an investment portfolio managed by her mother and the master. She learned to walk with a gliding step, to lower her eyes in a way that suggested modesty but invited pursuit, mastering the subtle art of seduction before she even understood desire. She was fed the best scraps from the kitchen, denied to the others, to ensure her hair remained glossy and her figure filled out in the pleasing curves demanded by the market. She was a hothouse flower cultivated in the middle of a slaughterhouse, a breathtaking anomaly amidst the grime and blood of the plantation. As she approached adolescence, the atmosphere around her changed, the master's gaze lingered longer, and the mistress's eyes grew cold with jealousy. The mother knew that the time was approaching, that the safety of the plantation was thinning, and that the auction block was the inevitable next stage of her daughter's existence. She prepared the girl for the sale as a soldier prepares for battle, adjusting her corset and smoothing her hair with trembling hands. She whispered fiercely into her daughter's ear, telling her to stand tall, to look the men in the eye just enough to intrigue them, but not enough to challenge them. "You must be sold high," the mother would say, the words heavy with a grief she could not express. "You must cost them so much gold that they will be afraid to break you." This was the economic reality of their lives. A high price tag was the only shield a slave woman had against casual violence. If she were sold cheaply, she could be used and discarded, sent to the fields when her novelty wore off. But if she cost $5,000, she was a luxury asset, a status symbol that required maintenance and care to preserve its value. The girl absorbed this terrifying wisdom, realizing that her beauty was both her curse and her only weapon. She looked in the mirror and saw not a face, but a lifeline, a fragile barrier between herself and the annihilation that awaited the rest of her race. On the day she was taken to New Orleans, the separation from her mother was dry-eyed and stoic, a scene rehearsed in nightmares for a decade. There were no screaming theatrics, only a final, crushing embrace and a silent understanding that they would likely never meet again on this earth. The mother watched the wagon roll away, her heart turning to ash, knowing she had succeeded in her task. She had created a masterpiece of the fancy trade, a creature so refined that she would never feel the bite of a frostbitten winter in a drafty cabin. But as the dust settled, the mother also knew she had condemned her daughter to a life of profound loneliness, trapped in a golden cage of constant sexual availability. She had saved her child's body from the field, but she had sold her soul to the highest bidder, a transaction driven by the purest, most desperate love imaginable. Now, standing on the velvet dais, the girl remembers the lemon juice stinging her knees and the smell of her mother's apron. She straightens her spine, the lessons of her childhood taking over, and prepares to play the role she was born to perform, while the men below begin to count their money. The atmosphere inside the rotunda on the day of the auction is heavy enough to choke a man, thick with the blue-gray haze of expensive tobacco smoke. It is not the honest scent of labor or earth, but the cloying, suffocating aroma of wealth and indulgence that permeates every corner of the hall. Hundreds of Havana cigars are burning simultaneously, their embers glowing like malevolent eyes in the dim light, creating a cloud that hangs low over the heads of the crowd. The smoke mixes with the sharp tang of cologne, stale alcohol, and the undeniable, musky scent of male lust that radiates from the gathered assembly. The energy in the room vibrates with a frequency that is indistinguishable from the feverish excitement of a high-stakes horse race or a riverboat gambling table. There is a tension here that transcends simple commerce. It is the thrill of the hunt, the primal anticipation of acquiring something rare, beautiful, and forbidden. The men standing on the marble floor are not the rough-hewn farmers or callous overseers who frequent the common slave pens looking for strong backs and calloused hands. These are the titans of the Southern economy, the aristocracy of the cotton and sugar kingdoms, dressed in tailored linen suits and silk cravats. They are the wealthiest planters from the Mississippi Delta, the sugar barons of Louisiana, and the professional speculators who trade in human lives as casually as they trade in stocks. They have traveled from their vast estates specifically for this event, their pockets lined with letters of credit drawn on the biggest banks in New Orleans and London. The object of their desire is not a worker who can clear a swamp or harvest a crop, but a luxury item that serves as a breathing testament to their absolute power. They are prepared to pay prices that would bankrupt a common man, bidding sums that defy all economic logic for the sake of possession. A prime fancy girl in this market can command a price of $5,000 or more, a staggering fortune in the currency of the 1850s. To put this sum into perspective, the same amount of money could purchase a substantial tract of fertile land or an entire herd of healthy, working horses. The sheer volume of cash changing hands turns the woman on the podium into the most expensive single asset in the room, more valuable than the building she stands in. She is no longer a person but a repository of capital, a living investment that marks her buyer as a man of limitless means. But before the auctioneer can accept these astronomical bids, the prospective owners demand a rigorous and deeply intrusive inspection of the merchandise. This process is a ritual of public humiliation, designed to strip away the last vestiges of the girl's modesty and assert total dominance before the sale is even concluded. Men in velvet waistcoats step forward, their movements languid and entitled, approaching the platform with the critical eye of a livestock judge. They circle the girl slowly, invading her personal space, their eyes scanning every inch of her visible skin for flaws, scars, or signs of rebellion. The inspection begins with a physical violation that mimics the examination of a thoroughbred mare before a purchase. A gloved hand reaches out, grasping the girl's jaw with a firm, possessive grip, forcing her head back to expose the line of her throat and the structure of her face. They order her to open her mouth, peering inside to inspect the health of her teeth and gums, checking for signs of disease or age. It is a clinical, dehumanizing act that reduces a complex human being to a collection of biological parts, assessed solely for their durability and aesthetic appeal. The buyers run their hands along her arms and shoulders, squeezing the muscle and flesh to test its firmness and youth. They are not looking for the strength to lift heavy loads, but for the soft, yielding texture that befits a woman destined for the parlor and the bedroom rather than the field. This tactile assessment is performed in full view of the crowd, a performance of ownership that invites the envy of those who cannot afford to touch. The girl must endure these caresses without flinching, feeling the leather of the gloves and the warmth of the hands that regard her as mere property. Following the physical examination, the auctioneer barks a command, and the girl is forced to demonstrate her grace and deportment. She is made to walk back and forth across the velvet-covered stage, pacing like a show pony while the men critique her gait, her posture, and the sway of her hips. They are looking for elegance, for the refined movement that suggests she has been trained in the drawing rooms of the elite. A stumble, a slouch, or a heavy step could shave hundreds of dollars off her price, signaling that she is common stock rather than a rare, fancy breed. Through this entire ordeal, the girl remains absolute marble, a statue carved from ice and discipline. Her face is a mask of utter impassivity, void of any spark of anger, fear, or sorrow that might betray the storm raging within her soul. She knows, with a terrifying clarity instilled by her mother, that her stoicism is the only currency she has left to spend. To show emotion on the auction block is a fatal error. Tears are seen as a sign of weakness or hysteria, traits that depreciate the value of a concubine. A woman who cries is viewed as damaged goods, a potential nuisance who will bring drama rather than pleasure to her new master. If she appears sullen or rebellious, the wealthy gentlemen will close their wallets, leaving her to the mercy of the lower-class speculators who deal in breaking difficult slaves. These lower-tier buyers are the monsters of her nightmares, men who buy cheap and use their property with brutal disregard for longevity. To fall into their hands means a life of degradation far worse than the golden cage of a wealthy planter, a descent into squalor and violence. Therefore, she holds her breath and locks her muscles, willing herself to be the perfect, unfeeling object they desire. She suppresses the urge to scream when a stranger's hand grazes her waist, suppresses the urge to vomit from the smell of their cigars and their lust. She understands that a high price is her only form of protection, however fragile and temporary it may be. If she sells for $5,000, she is an investment that must be protected, sheltered, and kept healthy to retain her value. If she sells for $500, she is disposable labor, easily replaced and easily destroyed. So she plays the game, lifting her chin and staring at a point on the back wall, refusing to make eye contact with the predators circling her feet. The silence of the girl stands in stark, deafening contrast to the raucous noise of the bidding floor. While the men shout numbers and crack jokes, exchanging wagers on her ultimate price, she exists in a bubble of terrified stillness. She is acutely aware that every nod of a head and every raised hand determines the geographic trajectory of her entire life. One bid could send her to a townhouse in the French Quarter, another to a steamboat heading upriver to Natchez, and yet another to a lonely plantation deep in the Delta. The auctioneer feeds on the energy of the room, his voice a rhythmic chant that drives the price higher and higher. He extols her virtues, praising her singing voice, her needlework, and her complexion, selling the fantasy of the tragic mulatto to the highest bidder. He presents her not just as a woman, but as a status symbol, a creature of such exquisite breeding that possessing her elevates the buyer above his peers. He manipulates the egos of the men, pitting them against one another until the bidding war becomes a contest of virility and wealth. As the price climbs past $4,000, the pool of potential buyers shrinks to a handful of the most powerful men in the South. The tension in the room snaps tight, the casual chatter dying down as the crowd watches the final duel for the prize on the stage. The girl feels the shift in the atmosphere, sensing that her fate is about to be sealed by the fall of the gavel. She remains motionless, a beautiful, tragic monument to the sins of a nation, waiting to be sold to the men who will become her jailer, her lover, and her god. The sharp, final crack of the auctioneer's gavel marks the immediate end of her public life and the beginning of her private erasure. She is led away from the podium, not in chains like the field hands, but often by the arm of her new owner, escorted to a waiting carriage with the eerie mockery of courtesy one might show a bride. The carriage ride is a transition between two worlds, moving from the noise of the market to the muffled silence of her new existence. She watches the streets of New Orleans pass by through the window, realizing that the city she inhabits is no longer a place of potential, but a map of boundaries she can no longer cross. Her new residence is often a townhouse in the French Quarter, hidden behind high walls and wrought iron gates that serve a dual purpose. These architectural marvels are designed to keep the prying eyes of the public out, but more importantly, they are built to keep the inhabitant in, acting as a beautiful, impregnable fortress. The interior of this prison is upholstered in the finest fabrics that the cotton trade can purchase, creating a sensory illusion of comfort. She walks on Persian rugs that muffle her footsteps, surrounded by gilded mirrors that reflect her own image back to her 1,000 times a day, reminding her of what she was bought for. He showers her with gifts that would make a free woman envy her station, draping her in emeralds and pearls. But every necklace fastened around her throat feels heavy and cold, a jeweled collar that marks her as the exclusive property of one man, a tag of ownership that glitters in the candlelight. She is attended by servants, often darker-skinned slaves who view her with a complex mixture of envy, pity, and disdain. To them, she is a class traitor living in the lap of luxury, sleeping until noon while they scrub floors, creating an isolation that leaves her without a single ally in the household. Her days are filled with the idle vacuity of a kept woman, a schedule of dress fittings, piano practice, and waiting. She is a doll placed on a shelf, expected to remain pristine and cheerful until the master decides to take her down and play with her. But when the sun sets and the candles are lit, the true nature of her employment becomes a terrifying reality. The bedroom, with its four-poster bed and silk canopies, is not a sanctuary of rest, but a workspace where she must perform regardless of her will or exhaustion. There is no concept of consent in this transaction. The bill of sale signed in the hotel rotunda stripped her of the right to say no. She must feign desire where there is only fear, and manufacture passion to stroke the ego of a man she may despise or even fear for his brutality. Every night is a negotiation of survival, a performance where a wrong word or a lack of enthusiasm could result in a loss of privileges. She learns to dissociate, to separate her mind from her body, letting him use the shell while she retreats deep into the fortress of her own thoughts. Looming over this fragile existence is the shadow of the other house, the master's legal residence where his white family lives. The fancy girl exists in direct opposition to the legitimate wife, a specter of adultery that is socially accepted by men yet privately loathed by women. If she lives on the plantation rather than in the city, the danger is immediate and visceral, as the physical distance between the two women shrinks. She is often housed in a wing or a cottage uncomfortably close to the main mansion, within sight of the woman whose husband visits her bed under the cover of darkness. The legitimate wife cannot punish her husband for his infidelity, as the law and society protect his right to property and his sexual autonomy. Instead, she directs the full force of her humiliated rage toward the enslaved woman, viewing her as a seductress rather than a victim of the same patriarchal system. The fancy girl lives in terror of the moments when the master leaves on business, removing her only source of physical protection. It is in these vacuums of power that the mistress often strikes, ordering brutal punishments for imagined infractions or minor failures in etiquette. There are documented whispers of poison found in food, or accidents involving boiling water or heavy machinery. The hatred is personal and venomous, fueled by the daily visual reminder that the husband prefers the company of a purchased slave to that of his wedded spouse. Even without physical violence, the psychological warfare is constant and draining. The mistress might stare from the balcony, her eyes tracking every movement of the girl in the courtyard, a silent promise of retribution that hangs in the humid air like thunder. The girl has no legal recourse, she cannot go to the sheriff or a judge to complain of mistreatment. In the eyes of the law, she is an object, and an object cannot be assaulted, it can only be damaged, a civil matter between the husband and wife regarding the destruction of assets. The luxury that surrounds her, the imported wines, the feather beds, the silk stockings, begins to feel like a shroud. She realizes that she is being consumed, eaten alive by a lifestyle that demands her total submission in exchange for material comforts she never asked for. Time becomes her greatest enemy, more relentless than the jealousy of a rival or the whims of a master. Her value is entirely predicated on the fleeting qualities of youth, the smoothness of her skin, the brightness of her eyes, and the firmness of her body. She watches the mirror with the obsessive scrutiny of a stockbroker watching a ticker tape, looking for the inevitable crash. The first gray hair or the first wrinkle is not a sign of wisdom, but a harbinger of doom that signals the end of her tenure in the house of silk. She knows that her master's passion is a finite resource, fueled by novelty and the thrill of possession. As familiarity breeds contempt, his visits will become less frequent, his gifts less generous, and his gaze will start to wander to the next auction catalog. The fear of being discarded is a cold knot in her stomach that never dissolves, keeping her awake long after he has fallen asleep. She has seen what happens to the favorites of yesterday. They do not retire to cottages, they are liquidated to pay gambling debts or simply to clear space. Pregnancy is another double-edged sword that hangs over her head constantly. While a child might bind the master to her emotionally, it also ruins her figure and creates a living complication that the legal wife will never tolerate. A child born of this union is a natural child, unrecognized by law, destined to inherit the mother's status as a slave. She looks at her own belly with fear, knowing that bringing a daughter into this world is simply providing the next generation of stock for the rotunda. She is trapped in a paradox where she must be seductive but not threatening, available but not demanding, a mother but not a parent. The walls of the French Quarter courtyard are high enough to block out the street, but they cannot block out the inevitable tragedy of her position. She is the queen of a kingdom that does not exist, wearing a crown of paste jewels that can be snatched away at any moment. Every sip of wine is a reminder of the transaction that put it in her hand, and every touch is a violation of the autonomy she was born without. The golden cage is not a metaphor, it is a very real, very expensive confinement system designed to extract pleasure from human suffering. And as the years grind on, she waits for the latch to open, not to let her free, but to cast her out into a world that has no place for a fallen queen. The illusion of safety that surrounded the fancy girl was always as brittle as spun sugar, held together only by the heartbeat of a single man. The terrifying reality of her existence was that her entire world could be shattered in an instant by a stray bullet in a duel, a bout of yellow fever, or a bad hand of poker. When the master of the house collapsed, whether from a heart attack at the gambling table or a stroke in his study, the clock immediately began to tick down on his concubine's life of privilege. The moment his breath ceased, the invisible shield of his protection evaporated, leaving her exposed to the harsh, cold winds of the law. For the grieving widow or the distant cousins inheriting the estate, the death was a tragedy. For the woman in the gilded cage, it was an apocalypse. In the eyes of the Southern legal system, she was not a mourning lover or a bereaved partner, but a tangible asset, a piece of movable property indistinguishable from a mahogany wardrobe. The first sign of the end was often the arrival of the court-appointed executors, men with ink-stained fingers and ledgers who walked through the house with no reverence for the dead. They moved from room to room, cataloging items for liquidation to satisfy the creditors who circled the estate like vultures sensing carrion. These men would march into the private sanctuary of her bedroom, their boots tracking mud onto the Persian rugs that she had been forbidden to stain. They did not knock or ask permission, they simply opened the door and began to assess the value of the furniture, the paintings, and the woman standing terrified in the corner. She would watch in silent horror as they wrote her name in a column of figures, sandwiched between the carriage horses and the silver tea service. Her humanity was stripped away with a stroke of a pen, reducing her complex, fearful soul to a dollar amount estimated to cover a fraction of the master's debts. If the master had died owing money, which was common among the planter class, who lived on credit against future harvests, the situation became desperate immediately. The fancy girl, often being the most valuable single item in the household inventory, was the first asset seized to pay off the banks. The cruelty of the liquidation process was absolute. The silk dresses she wore were stripped from her wardrobe and sold separately to second-hand dealers. The jewelry that had been placed around her neck as a sign of affection was clawed back by the estate, classified as stolen family heirlooms or unauthorized gifts. In the span of a single afternoon, the environment of luxury that had defined her existence was dismantled piece by piece. The perfumes were corked and taken away, the piano was crated up, and the heavy velvet curtains were pulled down, letting in the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. The woman who had spent her life protecting her skin from the sun and her hands from labor was now scrutinized by men who cared nothing for her aesthetic value. The bankers and lawyers saw her not as a work of art, but as a depreciating asset that needed to be converted into cash as quickly as possible. Her refined manners, her ability to speak French, and her skill at the keyboard were suddenly rendered utterly worthless in this new, brutal economy. The creditors did not need a woman to entertain guests, they needed capital, and if she could not be sold as a luxury, she would be sold as utility. This transition was often accelerated by the onset of the Civil War in the 1860s, which shattered the economy of the South. As the Union blockade tightened and the cotton money dried up, the market for $5,000 concubines collapsed almost overnight, leaving no buyers for fancy stock. With the luxury market dead, the fancy girl found herself in a terrifying limbo where her beauty was no longer a shield, but a liability. The men who came to collect the debts were hard, pragmatic souls who viewed her pampered existence with a mixture of contempt and class-based resentment. They looked at her soft hands and saw waste, they looked at her pale skin and saw arrogance that needed to be broken. To the overseers and slave traders who now held her fate, she was a useless mouth that had been spoiled by a master who was too soft, a creature that needed to be taught her true place. The hostility directed toward her was visceral, she was a symbol of the excesses of the elite, and tearing her down was a way to humiliate the memory of the men who owned her. They took a perverse pleasure in ordering her to perform menial tasks, mocking her clumsy attempts to sweep a floor or lift a heavy bucket. Her beauty, once the source of her power, now provoked irritation and aggression in her new captors. They sneered at her delicate constitution, calling her a princess or a whitewashed burden, and went out of their way to destroy the very features that had made her valuable. The psychological toll of this fall from grace was catastrophic. The woman had been raised to believe she was special, separate from the suffering of the field. Now, she was forced to confront the fact that she was, and always had been, a slave, subject to the same brutality as the ancestors she had been taught to pity. There was also a darker, biological calculation made by the creditors when they realized she could not be sold as a mistress. They looked at her hips and saw not a dancer, but a breeder, a vessel capable of producing more slaves to be sold in a desperate market. The fact that she was fancy meant she was likely healthy and well-fed, traits that made her prime stock for breeding farms in Virginia or the Deep South. The threat of being sold specifically for reproduction was a terror that eclipsed even the fear of the sugar cane fields. She was forced to endure invasive medical examinations by doctors hired to prove her fertility to potential buyers. These were not the aesthetic inspections of the rotunda, but clinical, cold assessments of her womb's capacity to generate profit for the estate's ledger. The protection of the other house vanished completely. The legitimate wife, if she survived the financial ruin, often facilitated this degradation with grim satisfaction. Selling the harlot to a rough life was the final act of revenge for years of silent humiliation endured while the husband was alive. As the war dragged on and the social order crumbled, the fancy girl was often cast out of the townhouse and into the chaotic pens of the wartime slave trade. She found herself huddled in damp cells with field hands who looked at her with suspicion, an alien in her own community. The delicate clothes she was left with turned to rags, and the slippers designed for carpets disintegrated in the mud of the holding yards. Her hair, once brushed 100 strokes a night, became matted and dull, the physical manifestation of her internal collapse. She learned quickly that her education in the arts was a handicap. Knowing how to curtsy did not help when fighting for a scrap of bread. The survival skills required now were sharp elbows and a hardness of spirit that had been systematically bred out of her by her mother's training. In the eyes of the men assessing the assets, she was a failed investment, a luxury item in a world that had gone to war and only cared for steel and bread. The tragic irony was that the very qualities that made her expensive, her softness, her grace, her whiteness, were now the reasons she was deemed worthless. The tragedy was absolute. She had been manufactured for a specific, narrow purpose that no longer existed. She was a ghost haunting the ruins of the aristocracy, a living artifact of a dead world, waiting to be discarded into the machinery of a war-torn labor system. Every time a door opened, she flinched, expecting not a gentleman with a bouquet, but a bailiff with shackles. The golden cage had been unlocked, but only to release her into a pit of wolves, where her beauty was nothing more than meat to be devoured. The final act of this tragic opera does not take place under the painted frescoes of a hotel rotunda, nor within the scented confines of a French quarter boudoir. The scene shifts abruptly to the squalid, rain-slicked courtyard of a debtor's prison, a place where the fallen aristocracy of the South sees their assets liquidated in the cold light of day. Here, the air does not smell of expensive tobacco and imported perfume, but of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the pervasive, metallic tang of desperation. The velvet dais has been replaced by an overturned crate, stained with the mud of the yard and the spit of the men who stand around it with their hands in their pockets. The woman standing on this crate bears little resemblance to the porcelain doll who captivated the city years ago, though the structure of her face remains painfully familiar. Her silk dress is tattered at the hem, stained with the grime of the holding cell, and her eyes no longer hold the spark of feigned seduction, but the dull glaze of absolute defeat. There is no bidding war today, no feverish competition between wealthy gentlemen seeking a status symbol to adorn their parlors. The crowd consists of bargain hunters, scavengers of human misery, and rough-hewn men looking for cheap labor to fill the gaps in their depleted workforces. The auctioneer is not the charismatic showman of the St. Louis Hotel, but a tired sheriff's deputy who mumbles through the proceedings, anxious to finish his grim task. He does not extol her musical talents or her fluency in French, for in this yard, such skills are considered useless affectations that drive down the value of the stock. She is sold not as a fancy girl, but as a prime wench, a generic term that strips away her specific history and lumps her in with the common laborers she was raised to pity. The price is insulting, a fraction of the thousands that were once paid for her, reflecting her transition from a luxury good to a disposable tool. The man who steps forward to claim her is the physical antithesis of her former masters, a figure carved from the brutality of the frontier. He is an overseer from a remote sugar plantation in the bayou, a man with skin leathered by the sun and eyes that gleam with a sadistic, class-based resentment. He does not wear fine linen or polished boots, he is dressed in rough homespun and carries a coiled whip at his belt like a badge of office. He buys her not because he needs a house servant, but because he is driven by a dark, perverse desire to possess and destroy something that was once considered better than him. He looks at her soft hands and her pale skin with a sneer, seeing them as symbols of an arrogance that must be crushed under the heel of real work. His purchase is an act of social vengeance, a deliberate plan to take the princess and drag her down into the muck of the harshest agricultural environment in the Western Hemisphere. The journey from the city is a descent into a green, humid hell, leaving behind the cobblestones for the impenetrable thickets of the Louisiana swamps. As the wagon rolls deeper into the bayou, the trees close in overhead, draped in Spanish moss that hangs like gray shrouds, blotting out the sky in the hope of rescue. Upon arrival at the plantation, the final vestiges of her former identity are stripped away with efficient, brutal speed. The tattered remains of her silk gown are torn from her body, replaced by a rough, scratchy shift made of Negro cloth, a fabric so coarse it chafes her skin raw within hours. Her shoes, once made of soft kid leather designed for carpeted floors, are taken away, leaving her feet bare and vulnerable to the hookworms and the sharp stubble of the fields. She is cast out of the manor house she once would have inhabited, sent to sleep on a cornshuck mattress in a drafty, overcrowding cabin that smells of sweat and despair. The next morning brings the ultimate horror, the sugar cane field, a landscape that consumed human lives with an appetite unmatched by cotton or tobacco. Sugar was a killer crop, requiring grueling, dangerous labor in conditions that often resembled a fever dream of heat and exhaustion. The overseer takes a grim pleasure in assigning her to the trash gang at first, and then, as if testing her breaking point, to the cutting line. He hands her a cane knife, a heavy, razor-sharp machete that weighs more than the fans she used to flutter, and orders her to keep pace with the veteran cutters. The sun, the very enemy her mother had fought so desperately to shield her from, now beats down on her unprotected skin with the force of a hammer. There is no bonnet to hide beneath, no lemon juice to bleach away the darkening, there is only the relentless, baking heat of the tropical latitude. Within days, the ivory complexion that had been her mother's pride and her own curse is burned red, blistering and peeling in agonizing sheets. The sun does not care about her price tag or her pedigree, it treats her skin with the same indifference it shows the mud at her feet, baking it into a hard, cracked leather. Her hands, which had spent a lifetime training to glide over piano keys and embroider delicate patterns, are destroyed by the cane. The sharp leaves of the sugar plant slice into her fingers like paper cuts, while the handle of the knife raises bloody blisters that burst and turn into calluses. The physical agony is compounded by the psychological torture of the overseer, who watches her struggle with a satisfied smirk. He mocks her when she stumbles, calling out her French name with an exaggerated accent, inviting the other field hands to laugh at the fallen white lady. But the other slaves do not laugh. They look on with a mixture of wariness and silent recognition of the system's cruelty. They see her clumsiness not as a fault, but as the tragic result of a life that left her unprepared for the reality of her condition, a bird with clipped wings thrown off a cliff. She learns the terrifying rhythm of the harvest, the grinding season, where the work continues 18 hours a day, fueled by the fear of the lash. She stands ankle-deep in the black, sucking mud of the swamp, her back bent double, hacking at the thick stalks until her muscles scream in protest. The mosquitoes rise in clouds from the stagnant water, feasting on her blood, carrying the malaria that kills without discrimination. She shivers with fever in the night, her teeth chattering, but at dawn, the horn blows, and she is forced back into the green wall of cane, a cog in the machine of production. The beauty that was supposed to be her salvation has become a distant, painful memory, a ghost that mocks her reflection in the ditch water. Her face is no longer smooth and round, it is gaunt, the cheekbones sharp from hunger, the eyes hollowed out by exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. Dirt ingrains itself into the pores of her skin, a permanent mask of grime that no amount of scrubbing can remove, marking her as part of the earth she tills. Scars from the cane leaves crosshatch her arms and neck, a new map of her existence written in raised, white keloids. The tragedy reaches its crescendo in a single, frozen image of her standing in the field as the sun sets over the swamp. She pauses for a breath, leaning on her machete, and for a fleeting second, her posture recalls the grace of the auction block. But the illusion is shattered by the mud caking her legs and the blood seeping from a fresh cut on her hand. This hand, which once held crystal goblets and played Chopin, is now a claw, shaped by the handle of the tool and the brutal necessity of survival. The overseer rides past, barking a command, and she flinched not with the coquettishness of a mistress, but with the terrified obedience of a broken animal. She bends down again, disappearing into the sea of tall grass, her identity completely submerged in the mass of laboring bodies. The system that created her, the complex economy of race, sex, and status, has finally completed its cycle. It raised her up as a specimen of perfection only to feed her into the grinder when her aesthetic value depreciated, extracting the last drop of utility from her bones. Her mother's desperate gamble has failed. The fancy trade was not an escape hatch, but a long, scenic detour on the road to the same hell. The golden cage protected her only as long as she was shiny. Once the tarnish set in, the door was opened, and the wolves were waiting. This is the true face of the trade, stripped of the romantic myths of hoop skirts and gentleman collars. It is a story that ends in the mud, proving that in the eyes of the slave power, beauty was never a gift to be cherished, but merely a commodity to be consumed until nothing remained but the husk. As the screen fades to black, we are left with the sound of the wind rustling the dry cane stalks, a dry, rattling whisper. It is the sound of a million lost souls, a requiem for the girl who was too beautiful for the field, but who ended up buried in it all the same.